All right, welcome everyone. In this explainer, we're going to do a really deep dive into the body's complex wiring. We'll be exploring the peripheral and the autonomic nervous systems, and then we're going to look at the absolute lifeline that powers it all, the blood supply to the central nervous system. So let's get right into it. So here's our game plan for this session. First, we'll start with a solid overview of the nervous system, just to get our bearings. Then we'll explore the peripheral and autonomic systems in a lot of detail. From there, we'll actually trace the blood vessels, the arterial supply in, and the venous drainage out of the CNS. And to wrap it all up, we'll put it into a clinical context so you can really understand what happens when that vital blood supply gets compromised.
Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1, a review of the nervous system's foundations. Now, the central nervous system, or CNS, you can think of it as the body's command center. It's in charge of all mental activity, our thoughts, our ability to learn, our memories. It's also working tirelessly behind the scenes to maintain homeostasis, and, critically, it's what keeps us connected and reacting to both our internal and external environment.
At its core, the nervous system really works in three basic steps, which you can see laid out perfectly here. First, it all starts with the sensory function. Receptors all over your body detect stimuli, and that information, that sensory input, is sent inward to the CNS, along what we call afferent neurons. The second step is the integrative function. This is where the CNS, using inner neurons, processes all that incoming information and decides what to do about it. And finally, that brings us to the motor function. The CNS sends a command outward along efferent neurons, telling effector cells out in the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, exactly how to respond.
So let's break down those two main highways of communication. On the left, you've got the afferent division, which is the sensory division. Its whole job is to bring information in to the CNS. Now, this is broken down even further into somatic afferent fibers. These carry signals from your skin, your muscles, your joints, and visceral afferent fibers, which transmit signals from your internal organs. Then on the right, we have the efferent or motor division. This is the pathway that sends commands out from the CNS. And this splits into two major systems: the somatic nervous system, which gives you conscious, voluntary control over your skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system, which automatically, unconsciously regulates things like your heart muscle, smooth muscle, and glands.
All right, time to move on to our second big topic, the peripheral nervous system. The easiest way to think about the PNS is that it's basically everything outside of that central command center. The formal definition is that it includes all the nervous structures outside the brain and spinal cord that are not protected by the meningeal layers. It's this vast, intricate information superhighway that connects the CNS to literally every other part of the body.
And this diagram gives us a great bird's-eye view of what we're talking about. The PNS is really built from two main sets of nerves. First, coming right off the brain itself, we have the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And then, branching out from the spinal cord all the way down the back, we have the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Together, these two sets form the body's primary information network.
Okay, this is a really important slide, so let's break down the precise numbers for those 31 pairs of spinal nerves. We have 8 pairs of cervical nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and finally 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. Now, you might be looking at that and wondering, wait a minute, why are there 8 cervical nerves if there are only 7 cervical vertebrae? That's a great question, and the note at the bottom explains this absolutely critical anatomical rule. The cervical nerves C1 through C7 actually exit the vertebral column above their matching vertebrae, but the C8 nerve exits below the C7 vertebrae, and that sets the pattern for the rest of the spine. C8 and all of the thoracic nerves that follow exit below their respective vertebrae. Now for the other half of the PNS puzzle, the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. As you can see here, these guys attach directly to the brain. They have to pass through little openings in the skull called foramina to get where they're going. They're all numbered with Roman numerals, from I to 12, and there's a specific pattern to where they attach. Cranial nerves I and II connect to the forebrain, while all the rest from 3 to 12 attach to the brainstem. Their main job? They primarily serve the structures of the head and the neck.
Okay, Section 3. Let's talk about the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS. You'll also hear this called the visceral motor system. And its whole world is everything we don't consciously control. It innervates all the non-skeletal muscles. That means the cardiac muscle that makes your heart beat, the smooth muscle that lines the walls of your organs and blood vessels, and all of your secretory glands. It's the ultimate automatic control center.
Now, the ANS is split into two main divisions that basically have opposite jobs. On the left, we have the sympathetic division. This is the famous fight, flight, or freeze system.
Its purpose is mobilization, getting the body ready for action and ramping up metabolism during times of stress. Its key neurotransmitter is norepinephrine rank, and it also has a major role in regulating our blood vessels. On the other side of the coin, on the right, is the parasympathetic division. This is the rest and digest system. It takes care of all the routine maintenance, conserving energy, and keeping things running smoothly. Its primary neurotransmitter is acetylcholine.
This table is awesome because it really shows you that constant push and pull, that tug of war, in action, organ by organ. Let's take a look. In the eye, the sympathetic system dilates the pupil to let more light in, while the parasympathetic constricts it. For the ciliary muscle, sympathetic relaxes it for focusing on distant objects, parasympathetic contracts it for close-up vision. The sympathetic system reduces saliva secretion, that dry mouth feeling when you're nervous. The parasympathetic increases it. The sympathetic system increases heart rate and the force of contraction, while the parasympathetic slows it all down. Sympathetic dilates the bronchi to get more air, parasympathetic constricts them. In the GI tract, sympathetic slows motility down, parasympathetic speeds it up for digestion. And here's something really important to notice at the bottom. Sweat glands and the erector pili muscles, those tiny muscles that give you goosebumps, they are uniquely controlled only by the sympathetic division. The parasympathetic system has no effect on them.
So how do all these autonomic signals actually get from the CNS to their targets? Well, the key is a structure called a ganglion. The best way to think of it is as a little junction box, or a synaptic relay station. Here's how the pathway works. The first neuron, which we call the preganglionic neuron, has its cell body inside the CNS. Its axon travels out to a ganglion. There, it synapses with the second neuron, the postganglionic neuron. And the cell body of the second neuron is located inside the ganglion. It's this second neuron's axon that then travels the rest of the way to the target organ.
Now, when we're talking specifically about the sympathetic division, a preganglionic axon has a choice to make once it enters the sympathetic trunk. It has three possible fates. First, path number 1. It can synapse right away, in the chain ganglion at the exact same level it entered. Second, path number 2. It can travel up or down the sympathetic trunk and then synapse in a different chain ganglion, either at a higher or a lower level. Or third, path number 3. It can pass straight through the chain ganglion without synapsing at all. If it does this, it forms what's called a splanchnic nerve, which travels a bit farther before it finally synapses in a different kind of ganglion, a prevertebral ganglion.
All right, we're shifting gears now into a really critical topic in Section 4, the arterial supply of the central nervous system. You have to remember, the brain and spinal cord are incredibly hungry organs. They're super metabolically active. And this vascular network is the lifeline that delivers the constant, nonstop supply of oxygen and nutrients they absolutely need to function.
So the brain gets its blood from two major sources, two main arterial systems. First, you have the internal carotid arteries, which are responsible for supplying the forebrain. And second, you have the vertebrobasilar system. This is formed when the two vertebral arteries join up, and it supplies the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the occipital lobe. Now, as you can see in this diagram, these two massive systems actually connect at the base of the brain, forming an arterial ring called the circle of Willis. This connection, which is called an anastomosis, is an incredibly important safety feature. It provides a backup, a redundant blood supply, just in case one of the main pathways gets blocked.
Let's actually trace the path of one of those main arteries, the internal carotid. It travels in 4 distinct segments. First is the cervical segment. This is the part that runs up through the neck, and interestingly, it has no branches. Second, it becomes the petrous segment as it passes through the carotid canal, a tunnel in the temporal bone. Third is the cavernous segment, which winds its way between the clinoid processes of the sphenoid bone. And finally, the fourth part is the cerebral segment. This is where it pierces through the dura mater and enters the cranial cavity. And this is where it gives off its major branches that feed the brain: the anterior cerebral artery, or ACA, the middle cerebral artery, MCA, the posterior communicating artery, and the anterior choroidal artery.
Now let's trace the other major pathway, the vertebral arteries. And this path is pretty complex. They start off branching from the subclavian arteries. From there, they travel upward, passing through these small holes on the sides of the cervical vertebrae called the transverse foramen, specifically from C6 up to C1. The path isn't straight, though. At the C2 vertebra, the axis, they move outward, and then they turn upward again to pass through the C1 vertebra, the atlas. After that, they enter the skull through that big opening at the base, the foramen magnum. And finally, right at the lower edge of the pons, the two vertebral arteries come together and unite, forming the single basilar artery.
Of course, the spinal cord needs its own dedicated blood supply too, and it gets it from three main sources. First, there's a single anterior spinal artery. It comes off the vertebral arteries, and as its name suggests, it supplies the front, or ventral, 2/3 of the cord. Second, there are two posterior spinal arteries, and they supply the back, or dorsal, 1/3 of the cord. And third, this primary supply gets some backup from what are called segmental arteries. These are little branches that come off other major arteries, like the cervical, intercostal, and lumbar arteries, and they just help reinforce the supply. And it's really important to remember the note here about clinically vulnerable areas. The thoracic levels from T1 to T4 and the front part of L1 are common spots for vascular damage to occur.
All right, so we've covered the delivery system, how blood gets to the CNS. Section 5 is all about how it gets back out. We're talking about the venous drainage. And a really key point to keep in mind here is that the veins of the head and neck actually show a lot more anatomical variation from person to person than the arteries do. They're not as predictable.
So, this diagram shows us the dural venous sinuses, which are a really unique part of this drainage system. See, these aren't your typical veins. They are actually large channels that are formed between the layers of the dura mater. Their job is to collect all the deoxygenated blood from the brain's superficial veins, which drain into places like the sagittal sinus, and from its deep veins, which drain into the transverse and sigmoid sinuses. But they do more than that. They also drain cerebral spinal fluid. And all of it, all that blood in CSF, ultimately funnels into the internal jugular vein to be returned to the heart.
And that brings us to our final section, the clinical context. Now that we've spent all this time understanding the incredibly intricate anatomy of the CNS blood supply, we can finally look at what happens when it goes wrong. We can explore the really devastating consequences that occur when this system fails, leading to things like ischemia, which is a lack of blood flow, and hemorrhages, which is bleeding.
This table does a fantastic job of linking the vascular anatomy directly to the clinical symptoms you would see. So, if there's a blockage in the anterior cerebral artery, which supplies the frontal cortex, you can expect to see problems with personality, thought, and voluntary movement. If the middle cerebral artery is affected, and this one supplies the lateral lobes, including Broca's and Wernicke's areas, you'd likely see weakness in the face and arm or language problems called aphasia. Ischemia in the posterior cerebral artery, which feeds the temporal and occipital lobes, very often results in vision loss and trouble with reading. And finally, a blockage in the vertebro-basilar system can be absolutely catastrophic because it affects the brainstem and cerebellum. This can lead to symptoms like quadriplegia, ataxia, and severe problems with swallowing and vision.
Now let's compare two types of bleeding that happen outside the brain tissue itself. On the left, we have an epidural hematoma. This is an arterial bleed, so it's high pressure. It's often caused by a skull fracture at a weak point called the pterion, which tears the middle meningeal artery. The classic sign here is something called a lucid interval, where the person seems okay for a while before they decline very rapidly. On the right is a subdural hematoma. This is a venous bleed caused by torn bridging veins. Because venous blood is under much lower pressure, the symptoms develop much more slowly.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. We have mapped out this incredibly complex and absolutely vital network, from the biggest arteries all the way down to the individual nerves they supply. We've seen how perfectly it all works together, but also just how fragile it can be. So the question I want to leave you with is this. Given the intricate and fragile nature of this vascular network, how can modern medicine get better at predicting and, more importantly, preventing these catastrophic failures?